Hey, so today we're going to talk about ways to improve our classes, specifically using this. And it sounds kind of strange to just say this, but that's really what we're going to discuss, using the reserved word this to improve our classes. So what is this? And it's going to sound confusing every time I say that because it seems like I'm using this out of context, but that's really the word. So we just got to, I guess, deal with it, right? But within an instance method or a constructor, basically when you're inside of a class, the reserved word this is a reference to the current object that you're working inside of. So I like to just think of it as it's the way that an object talks about itself or speaks of itself. It's like when you or I say the word I, or say I like such and such. I means I'm just talking about myself. Well, that's again the same idea. In Java, when you use the word this inside of a class, it's the object basically referring to itself. So, I mean, that's really the heart of it. If you can understand that simple idea, well, maybe not simple is the right word, but if you can understand that idea, then you got it. And it's just the logistics from there on out. But again, it tends to be confusing. It just does until you get it. Once you get it, you're like, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. But at first, it absolutely tends to be a bit confusing. So anyway, inside of a class, when you use the reserved word this, you're just referring to any member, right? So whether that member is a instance field or variable, or whether it's a method, or it can even be a constructor, as we'll see. When you use the reserved word this, well, that's what you can do with it. So let's just look at some examples of how you can use this, and I think, or at least hope, that it will start to make sense for everyone. Okay, so there are two ways that we can use this. The first is with shadowed parameters. So this is the most common reason for using the this keyword. And a very fair question is why. And I mean, in many ways, it's good to ask this question. And well, it's almost always good to ask that question. Like, why would you want to do something? I feel like with shadowed parameters, I can't give a real great answer because it's not like using this enables you to do anything that you could not do without it, right? It's not like we're adding any new power or feature or possibility. It's really, I'll just say, it's a better way of writing code. It's just something that you'll see if this is a field that you decide to pursue further. I promise you, it's what all, I guess, seasoned developers would do. It's an idea that exists in pretty much every language I've ever seen. It's a very common practice that we want to get into so that we can just, I guess, communicate the way programmers have agreed to communicate. So again, it's not adding any new possibilities or anything. Yeah, you're not adding anything that you couldn't do without using this. So I hope you just kind of trust me when I say that it's really just about doing things the best way, the right way. That's what this is all about, okay? So we have a class here. It's a point class. You can see it has two private instance fields. I initialized them equal to 0 when I declared them. I probably shouldn't have done that, but that's okay. That's not the point for this. All right, you can see it has one constructor, and we have just the packed constructor that's being passed two integer values, a and b. And then inside the constructor, we're setting x equal to a, and we're setting y equal to b. And this is a very standard way that we've been writing our classes. And again, there's nothing wrong with this in the sense that it works perfectly fine. But shadowed parameters, using this and shadowed parameters is just basically a cleaner way of writing this same code, right? So the idea of a shadowed parameter, let me just show you in the example, and then we'll go back to why it's called shadowed, right? So here, we've got the same class, but it's been modified simply. And here's where it's modified, right? We have int x and int y. So our parameters have been renamed from a and b to be x and y. And this is the key to the idea of it being shadowed, right? Here, this parameter is named x. It's shadowing the class level variable named x, right? So I hope you can see inside of this constructor right here, there are actually two variables with the name x. There is our class level variable, which is declared up here, our instance variable, and it's named x. And then there's also the parameter value named x. Now, whenever, I guess, you have two variables with the same name inside of the same scope, right? They both exist inside of this constructor. If you just say x, it's going to automatically default to the local parameter. So the x inside of the constructor, if we were to just say x, it's going to refer to the parameter x. So we have to use this dot x if we want to reference the class level variable. So this dot x refers to the class level variable, right? And again, the idea goes back to this is how an object refers to itself. It's like saying mine or my or I, right? This point could say my x value is equal to x, where x is the parameter value. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Again, they're shadowed because we're using the same identifier, right? The parameter is named x, and the instance field is named x. They're both called x. So again, I'm using this to refer to the class level x, and I'm using this dot y to refer to the class level y, versus on the right hand side, x is the parameter value and y is the other parameter value. So all I'm doing here is I'm saying, okay, my x value, or the point would be saying my x value is equal to the x value that you pass the constructor. I hope that makes sense. All right. So that's the first way that we can use this. It's when we use shadowed parameters, and you'll see this all the time in constructors and all the time in modifiers. And we'll look at an actual example of that in Eclipse in just a couple moments. All right, so that's the first way that we'll use this. Here's the second way, and I'd say this is not done as often just because of use, right? I mean, you only write constructors once, but you use parameters all the time in a class. But I'd say this is maybe the more meaningful modification, and we use this from within a constructor to call another constructor in the same class. So most commonly, we'll see this used by a default constructor to call the packed constructor. Okay, so let's just look at an example of it, and I think it will make sense. All right, so for example, we're going to look at the rectangle class. And I think we looked at the rectangle class, or a rectangle class, initially in one of our first videos about classes. Here's a second example of another rectangle class. Okay, so our rectangle class has two instance fields, width and height. That's the same. It has two constructors. The first is a default constructor. The second is our packed constructor. Now I'm going to come back to the default constructor, because this default constructor is really what we're talking about here, right? But I want to point out first that you'll hopefully notice that we're using shadowed parameters in the packed constructor. So my class has two instance variables, width and height, and then I'm passing it a width and a height as well. So I'm saying this dot width, or the rectangle's width, is equal to the parameter's width. And then the rectangle's height is equal to the parameter height. So I'm initializing my rectangle's parameters with shadowed, or I should say the rectangle's properties with shadowed parameters. So that's back to the first way that we can use this. Here's the second way that we use this. So you'll hopefully see that I'm just saying this. Okay, well, what is that even referring to? When I say this, it's not like this dot, it's just flat out this. That means look for another constructor inside the class. Now, which constructor is it going to look for? You can see this is followed by two parameters, right? I'm just passing it, in this case, 1 and 1. So it's basically saying look for a constructor with two integer parameters. So this 1, 1, it's going to call this packed constructor, passing it 1 and 1. So if we were to construct a default rectangle, the flow would basically look like this. We'd come into our default constructor. Our default constructor would call the packed constructor, passing it 1 and 1, and then our packed constructor is going to initialize the width to 1 and also the height to 1. So again, the heart of this idea is this, when used in this context, is going to call another constructor. In this case, it will call a constructor that has 2 integer parameters. Fortunately, we do have a constructor that meets those standards, has that signature. So it's going to pass 1 for the width and 1 for the height, and then it's going to use those parameters in the packed constructor to initialize our width and our height. Okay, so you'll notice this class is incomplete. I normally have accessors and modifiers as well, but there it is. That's the second example of how we can use this. All right. One last thing we need to say when we're using this to call another constructor, and that's just simply if you were to call another constructor from a constructor using this, it has to be the first line of code in the constructor. So here, this constructor is super simple. All I'm doing, my default constructor is doing, is simply calling the rectangle class. But sometimes, as we get into more advanced code, we'll have constructors that need to do a bit more than just basic initialization, and you might be tempted to write other code inside this default constructor. You can, but if you're to write other code, it's got to follow the call, this call. I should also mention, though, that in general, if you're using this, you probably shouldn't put any other code in here. The power of using this to call another constructor is that it enables you to put all of your code for constructing an object into one constructor. So everything for constructing a rectangle class will be confined to this packed constructor. Why is that important? Well, again, this is really basic code right now, right? All we're doing is initializing 2 integer values, but we're going to get into much more advanced concepts, in which case, like if you're initializing, doing all sorts of stuff in code, you don't want to write it twice. You only want to write it once. I mean, one, just to save yourself some work, but more importantly, just for consistency. Let's say you're typing up 20 lines of code. It's very easy to make a mistake on one of those 20 lines of code, right? Or, well, I should say, so that they don't match, right? Maybe you intended for them to do the same thing, but you type it slightly differently on one than the other. The other thing is you could just flat out make a mistake, in which case if that code's in 2 places, you might have to debug and fix it twice, versus if it's in just a single location, you just have to go through and fix it once, okay? So those are the 2 ways that we use this. Let's look at an example now with actual code. So this is our student class. I don't remember when we first typed up this student class, but that doesn't matter. Well, I can see I typed it on April 27th, but regardless, I'm going to update this class or improve this class using the 2 methods that we just looked at, well, using this, okay? So I've got 2 instance fields, name and GPA. I've got 2 constructors. I'm going to come back to the default constructor. I'm going to start on the packed constructor. So we said there are 2 ways that you can use this. The first is with shadowed parameters. A shadowed parameter has to have the exact same name as the instance field that it's shadowing. So my parameter, I'm going to rename it from just n to name. And then my second parameter, I'm going to rename it from GPA, or excuse me, from G to GPA. All right, now obviously I get an error because there's no longer a variable with the name. Let's see what would happen if I was to just do this. Okay, it works in the sense that it doesn't give me a syntax error, but it does give me a warning. What does it say? It says the assignment to variable name has no effect. I hope you can see that. I know the font is rather tiny, but again, it's saying the assignment to variable name has no effect, right? What does that even mean? Why does it have no effect? Well, the reason it has no effect is because all I'm doing is I'm saying parameter name is equal to the parameter name. I mean, that does nothing, right? I'm saying name equals name. Well, of course name equals name. I'm setting name equal to itself. It's going to have no effect. It's just not going to do anything. Let me make another common mistake, okay? Name equals this dot name. What would this do? Well, now I'm setting my parameter name equal to the class level variable name. But what is the class level variable name equal to? It's not really equal to anything because we have not yet initialized it. We haven't given it initial value when we declare it. We just simply said string name. So this, I mean, I guess it's just going to set the parameter So regardless of what we pass it, it's going to set it equal to an empty string. So that's just not going to work. Let's fix it the right way. So the right way would be this dot name equals name. Okay, now what are we going to do? And you can kind of see, I hope, right? Even now, like Eclipse is smart enough to highlight all my references to name in yellow, and you can see there's 4 of them, right? It's saying, yeah, you're referring to the class level variable name and setting that equal to the parameter name. So we've got that right now. Let's do the same thing with this dot GPA, okay? So I now have name and I have GPA set correctly using shadowed parameters. Let's go down to our setters and update them as well. So we can use shadowed parameters in our setters as well, and we should, right? And this is all it's going to really be. This dot name equals name, and this dot GPA equals GPA. And we're doing the exact same thing we did in the constructor, right? We're saying, okay, on the left-hand side, I'm referring to my instance variable. On the right-hand side, I have a parameter with the same identifier. I'm going to set my class level variable equal to the parameter value, and that's all we're doing. There's no reason to do that in a getter because there's no parameter, so it just doesn't make sense, okay? Let's look now at rewriting our constructor. Our packed constructor is good. We've updated it. Let's now use this in the second way. And that is to call our packed constructor. So I'm going to say this, and right away I get an error, right? I won't get into it, but basically if you left it like this would be recursion. It's this trying to call the default constructor itself, right? You get stuck in this infinite loop. So we need to call the packed constructor, and I'm going to do just that. I'll say Joe. Now again, I still have an error message. Why? I'm going to try to click on this and see if it gives it. Yeah, there it is. That's perfect, right? It says the constructor student string is undefined. Basically, the way I have it written right now is that I'm saying I want to call a student constructor, right? I'm inside of the student class, so this refers to another constructor inside the student class with a single string parameter. Why is that not okay? Well, we don't have a constructor with a single string, just a string for a parameter. We do have another constructor that has a string, but look at that, it also has a double. So we've got to pass it a second value, so I'll do that. I'm just going to say 0. Joe's not very good at school, right? So now when I call or construct a student using this default constructor, it's going to then in turn call the packed constructor, passing Joe for the name and 0 for the GPA. And then inside of the packed constructor, it will initialize those instance fields to Joe and 0. All right. So we could write an example of how we'd call this. Let me see if I can remember which project this is in. It makes sense that it's in the classes example. Yeah, there it is. Okay, so I'm going to just go over and, well, create a new class. So I'll just call it student main, and I'll check off my public static void main. And let's just construct a student, look at what it would do, and then be done. All right, so I'll say student s equals new student. All right, so I'm going to say the default, I'm going to call the default constructor in my student class. So set, I'm declaring student s, so it's a variable on the left-hand side of type student with the identifier s, and I'm setting it equal to a new student object. How am I constructing that student object? Well, it's going to call, as I've already said, that default constructor because I don't have any parameters. So we'll call that default constructor. The default constructor in turn will call the packed constructor, passing Joe and 0. And then the packed constructor will set the instance field name equal to Joe and the instance field GPA equal to 0. And we'd have our new student. All right, we could do some more with the accessors and modifiers if we want to. But I don't think, well, that won't change at all from what we've been doing in the past. All right, so that's it. I hope this is helpful, and I hope that you all are doing very well.